Before we begin, it's important to remember that this video is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Imagine being locked in a dark, cold cellar, not for a crime but because you feel a sadness you can't explain, or you hear voices that no one else can. Your family, confused and terrified, believes you're possessed by a demon, or that your mind has simply broken. They've paid the local jailer to keep you in chains, hidden away from the world. This wasn't a scene from a horror movie. For hundreds of years, this was the reality of mental health care in America. Today, 1 in 5 American adults experiences mental illness in a given year. We talk about therapy, medication, self-care, and brain chemistry. We have a language for it. But how did we get from chains and cellars to cognitive behavioral therapy? How did we move from believing in demonic possession to understanding neurotransmitters? The journey is not a straight line. It's a brutal, shocking, and ultimately hopeful story of how America has confronted the ghosts in its own mind. And understanding this history is the single most important tool you can have to understand the mental health system we have today. Its triumphs, its failures, and the fight that is still far from over. This series is your roadmap. We are going to uncover the forgotten stories, the terrifying treatments, and the quiet heroes who dragged mental health care out of the dungeons and into the light. To start, we have to go back to a time before the United States was even a country. In the colonial era of the 1600s and 1700s, there was no concept of mental illness as we know it. There were no psychiatrists, no therapists, no diagnoses like depression or schizophrenia. Instead, there were the distracted, the lunatics, and the possessed. These weren't medical terms, they were social and spiritual ones. A person's strange behavior wasn't seen as a symptom of a sick brain, but as a sign of a sick soul. It was a moral failing, a divine punishment, or worse, the work of the devil himself. Think about the world these early colonists lived in. It was a harsh, unforgiving landscape where survival depended on hard work, social cohesion, and a rigid adherence to community norms. In this world, there was no room for someone who couldn't pull their weight. If your mind kept you from working the farm, caring for your family, or participating in the church, you weren't just a burden. You were a threat to the entire community's survival. So what happened to you? There were no hospitals or asylums. The treatment, if you can even call it that, was entirely local and informal. The first line of defense was the family. Families were expected to manage their own. This often meant confinement. A son, daughter, husband, or wife suffering from a severe mental crisis would be locked away in an attic, a spare room, or a cellar. They were hidden from public view, not just to protect the community, but to protect the family from immense social shame. It was a secret kept behind closed doors, a source of private anguish and fear. If a family couldn't or wouldn't handle the situation, the responsibility fell to the town. The solution was rarely compassionate. The mentally ill were often lumped in with paupers, drunks, and criminals. They were thrown into crude almshouses, basically poorhouses or common jails. Here, conditions were abysmal. People were chained to walls, left in their own filth, and subjected to the cruelty of guards who saw them as less than human. The goal was not treatment. It was containment. It was about removing a disruptive element from society so everyone else could go on with their lives. This approach was fueled by the dominant force in colonial life, religion. For the Puritans and other religious groups, the world was a battlefield between God and Satan. Unexplained behavior, from deep melancholy to frantic mania, was easily interpreted as evidence of demonic possession. The most infamous example of this, of course, is the Salem witch trials of 1692. While a complex event with political and social causes, many historians now believe that some of the afflicted girls and the accused witches may have been suffering from mental illnesses that were misinterpreted as supernatural phenomena. Their visions, their seizures, their social withdrawal, all were seen through a lens of religious terror. The prescription wasn't medicine, it was prayer, exorcism, and in the case of the accused, a hangman's noose. But not everyone was treated with such extreme prejudice. There was a grim distinction made between the distracted and the furious. If you were merely distracted, what we might today call depressed or anxious, you might be pitied, prayed for, and largely tolerated as long as you could function. You were seen as eccentric, melancholic, or touched by a deep sadness. But if you were furious, violent, unpredictable, manic, the community's fear would kick in. You were a direct threat to the social order. Public whippings, being put in stocks, or banishment from the town were common punishments designed to literally beat the madness out of you or cast you out entirely. We have to remember this was a pre-scientific age. The brain was a complete mystery. The prevailing medical theory, inherited from ancient Greece, was that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Madness was believed to be caused by an imbalance of these fluids. So, for those who could afford any kind of medical care, the treatments were just as brutal as the social ones. Doctors, or rather physicians of the time, would subject patients to terrifying procedures designed to rebalance the humors. This included bloodletting, where a patient was bled, sometimes to the point of fainting, to remove excess humors. They used powerful emetics and laxatives to induce violent purging, believing they were expelling the source of the madness. And they would dunk patients in ice-cold water until they nearly drowned, a primitive form of shock therapy meant to jolt the mind back into a state of reason. These weren't acts of malice, not usually. They were desperate measures born from a complete lack of understanding, a fusion of primitive medicine and deep-seated superstition. In this world, the mind was a dark, unknowable place, and when it went wrong, the only tools they had were chains, fear, and faith. For nearly 200 years, this was the unquestioned reality. The mentally ill were America's hidden shame, locked away in basements and jails, their suffering invisible and their humanity denied. It was a system of neglect and fear, a patchwork of local solutions that solved nothing. But as the 18th century came to a close and the United States was born in the fire of revolution, a radical new idea began to take hold, sparked by the Enlightenment's focus on reason and human dignity. What if these people weren't possessed? What if they weren't morally corrupt? What if they were sick, just like someone with a fever or a broken bone? This one question would ignite a revolution in care, leading to the birth of a powerful and terrifying new institution designed to cure the incurable: the asylum. The word asylum today conjures images of horror, of straitjackets, padded cells, and shadowy figures lurking in long, dark hallways. But in the early 19th century, the asylum wasn't a place of fear. It was a beacon of hope. It was born from a revolutionary philosophy known as moral treatment. The idea was shockingly simple, yet it flew in the face of centuries of practice. It argued that the mentally ill were not possessed by demons or morally bankrupt animals. They were human beings suffering from a disease, and like any other patient, they deserved kindness, respect, and a calm, orderly environment to heal. No more chains, no more dungeons. Instead, patients would live in clean, comfortable rooms. They would work in gardens, read in libraries, attend lectures, and engage in polite conversation. The therapy was the environment itself, a structured, compassionate routine designed to restore order to a disordered mind. It was a beautiful utopian vision. And at the forefront of this movement in America was a man whose signature you'll find on the Declaration of Independence: Dr. Benjamin Rush. Often called the father of American psychiatry, Rush was a true product of the Enlightenment. He believed that the human mind, like the universe, operated on rational principles and could be repaired through scientific intervention. Working at the Pennsylvania Hospital, he was one of the first physicians in America to treat mental illness as a medical problem. He spoke with his patients, he documented their case histories, he tried to understand the roots of their distress. This was groundbreaking. But Rush's science was still in its infancy, and his methods were a disturbing mix of compassion and brutality. He believed mental illness was caused by inflammation of the brain, a disease of the blood vessels. His solution: bloodletting. He would drain patients of vast quantities of blood, sometimes more than half their body's supply, believing it would relieve the pressure on the brain. He also invented a terrifying device called the tranquilizing chair. Patients would be strapped into a chair, their head enclosed in a wooden box, their limbs immobilized for hours, sometimes days. Rush believed this sensory deprivation would calm the mind's overstimulated blood vessels. He developed a gyrator, a spinning board meant to sling blood away from the head, and dunked patients in ice-cold water to shock their systems back into balance. To us it looks like torture, but in Rush's mind it was medicine. He was replacing random, punitive cruelty with what he saw as targeted scientific treatment. He may have been profoundly wrong, but his core idea that the mind could be healed was the seed from which the entire American mental health system would grow. This idea fueled the creation of the first asylums, institutions designed from the ground up to be therapeutic. The most famous architectural model for these new hospitals was the Kirkbride Plan. Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride believed the very building a patient lived in was a tool for their recovery. His designs were sprawling, majestic structures, often built on hilltops overlooking serene landscapes. They were palaces of healing. The layout was specific: a central administration building with long segregated wings fanning out on either side, like a giant V, men on one side, women on the other. The wings were tiered. The most well-behaved, high-functioning patients lived in the rooms closest to the center, with the best views and most privileges. The further you went down the hall, the more disruptive the patients became, until you reached the most disturbed individuals at the very ends of the wings. The architecture was meant to inspire calm and rationality. Corridors were long and straight, with a window at the end of each one to bring in light and air. Every patient had their own private room, a radical departure from the squalid group cells of the past. There were parlors, libraries, workshops, and beautiful manicured grounds for recreation. For the first time, the state was investing millions of dollars to build sanctuaries for the mentally ill. But there was a problem. These state-of-the-art hospitals were few and far between. For every patient enjoying the therapeutic gardens of a Kirkbride asylum, there were thousands still languishing in the shadows, chained in the basements of almshouses and rotting in the cells of local jails. And that is where a quiet, unassuming schoolteacher from Massachusetts would enter the story and change everything. Her name was Dorothea Dix. In 1841, she volunteered to teach a Sunday school class to female inmates at the East Cambridge jail. What she found there shattered her world. In an unheated, foul-smelling cellar, she discovered several mentally ill women locked away with common criminals. They were naked, chained to the walls, and living in their own filth. The jailer told her they were beyond hope, that they couldn't feel the cold. Dix, incensed, went to the local court and secured an order to have the cell heated. She won, and in that small victory she found her life's calling. For the next 2 years, Dorothea Dix embarked on an unprecedented journey. She traveled over 10,000 miles across Massachusetts, systematically investigating every jail, almshouse, and poorhouse she could find. She was a meticulous researcher, documenting every horror she witnessed with cold, hard facts. She saw people locked in cages, pens, and closets. She saw them flogged, starved, and chained in darkness. She saw a man whose keepers had gored him with a fork to make him obey. She compiled her findings into a devastating report, a memorial, which she presented to the Massachusetts state legislature. Her words were a thunderclap. She didn't plead for pity. She demanded justice. She shamed the lawmakers with their own hypocrisy, describing in graphic detail the barbaric treatment being carried out in their own backyards. "I proceed, gentlemen," she wrote, "briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." The report was an explosive success. The legislature, shocked and shamed into action, voted to dramatically expand the state's mental hospital at Worcester. But Dix was just getting started. She took her crusade on the road, traveling from New Jersey to Illinois, from Louisiana to New Hampshire. In state after state, she repeated her method: investigate, document, and deliver a powerful fact-based appeal to the legislature. She was a force of nature, a one-woman lobbying firm for the forgotten, and she was impossibly successful. Over the course of her life, her tireless advocacy led to the founding or expansion of more than 30 mental hospitals across the United States and even in Europe. This was the golden age of the asylum, fueled by the philosophy of moral treatment and propelled by the unstoppable engine of Dorothea Dix. A massive wave of construction swept the nation. Grand, hopeful institutions rose from the countryside, each one a testament to the belief that society had a duty to care for its most vulnerable citizens. For a fleeting moment, the utopian vision seemed within reach. The asylum was not a prison but a cure. It was a structured, compassionate world built to mend a broken mind. But this golden age was built on a fragile foundation. The system was expanding faster than anyone could have imagined, and the very ideals that gave it life were about to be crushed under the weight of its own success. The beautiful palaces of healing were about to become something else entirely. They were on the verge of becoming warehouses for the unwanted, places where the theories of moral treatment would die, replaced by the grim realities of overcrowding, underfunding, and the simple, terrifying fact that not everyone could be cured. And that single terrifying fact, that not everyone could be cured, became the bedrock of a new, darker chapter. The dream of the asylum as a peaceful, curative retreat was beginning to crumble under the immense weight of reality. The asylums of the mid-19th century were victims of their own perceived success. As more were built, states and counties saw them as a convenient solution for a whole host of social problems. They became the destination not just for those with profound mental illness, but for the elderly with dementia, for individuals with developmental disabilities, for alcoholics, and for anyone deemed socially inconvenient. The population inside these institutions exploded. A hospital designed for 250 patients might soon hold 1,000. The serene, single rooms of the Kirkbride plan were subdivided, then subdivided again. Beds were crammed into hallways, day rooms, even basements. The meticulously manicured grounds, once used for therapeutic walks and gardening, became inaccessible to the vast majority of patients who were now confined to crowded, locked wards. With this explosion in population came a catastrophic drop in funding per patient. The staff-to-patient ratios that made moral treatment possible, the one-on-one attention, the compassionate guidance, became a distant memory. A handful of overworked, underpaid, and often untrained attendants were now responsible for hundreds of patients. Compassion gave way to control. Therapy was replaced by containment. The goal was no longer to cure, but simply to manage a chaotic, overwhelming, and often frightening population. The asylum was no longer a hospital. It was becoming a human warehouse. And it was in this decaying landscape, in the cold, damp cellar of a Massachusetts jail, that one of the most powerful movements in American history was born. It didn't start with a politician or a doctor. It started with a 39-year-old retired schoolteacher, a woman of frail health but unbreakable will. Her name was Dorothea Lynn Dix. In March of 1841, Dix volunteered to teach a Sunday school class to female inmates at the East Cambridge jail. What she found there didn't just shock her. It ignited a fire that would consume the rest of her life. In a foul, unheated cellar, she found women who were not criminals. They were mentally ill, locked away with no heat, no sanitation, and no hope. They were chained to walls, living in their own filth, treated not as people but as animals. When Dix asked the jailer why these women were kept in such abhorrent conditions, he replied simply that lunatics do not feel the cold. That single callous remark was a declaration of war. Dorothea Dix, a woman from a society that barely allowed women a public voice, decided to make it her life's mission to give voice to the voiceless. She spent the next 2 years on a quiet, methodical, and relentless crusade. She traveled across the entire state of Massachusetts, visiting every jail, every almshouse, every private home where the mentally ill were kept. She wasn't just looking, she was documenting. With a small notebook and an iron will, she recorded everything she saw. The horrors she uncovered were almost medieval. She found people locked in cages, sheds, and cellars. She saw men and women, naked and shivering, chained to their beds. She documented individuals who were regularly beaten, starved, and left to languish in darkness for years on end. This wasn't a failure of a single institution. It was a systemic, society-wide atrocity, hidden in plain sight. One man she found was in a small cage, where he had been for 3 years. When the door was opened, he would crawl out, stand, and then immediately fold himself back into the cramped posture his cage had forced upon him. He had forgotten how to stand upright. After 2 years of this grueling investigation, Dorothea Dix had built an irrefutable case. She transformed her meticulous notes into a searing, eloquent, and utterly devastating document. It was called the Memorial to the Legislature of Massachusetts. This was her weapon. In an age where women were not permitted to speak before legislatures, she had a male colleague, a doctor and social reformer named Samuel Gridley Howe, present it for her in January 1843. The words she wrote were a thunderclap in the halls of power. She did not speak in generalities, she spoke in specifics. She named towns. She described individuals. She forced the lawmakers to see what she had seen. "I proceed, gentlemen," she wrote, "to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience." The detail was graphic, the tone was righteous, and the message was undeniable. She was holding up a mirror to the soul of Massachusetts, and the reflection was monstrous. The memorial caused an immediate and explosive political firestorm. Many lawmakers were outraged, not at the conditions, but at Dix for exposing them. They called her a liar, a sensationalist, a meddling woman. But her evidence was too precise, too overwhelming to be dismissed. She had the facts, and the facts were damning. Her methodical, almost surgical approach had anticipated their every objection. The public was horrified. The press amplified her findings. the political pressure became unbearable. In the end, the legislature buckled. A bill was passed to dramatically expand the state's mental hospital at Worcester, providing proper, humane care for those Dix had championed. It was a stunning victory, but for Dorothea Dix, it was only the beginning. Massachusetts was not an anomaly, it was the blueprint. She knew the same horrors existed in every state, so she took her crusade on the road. For the next 4 decades, she became a tireless, unstoppable force of nature. Her methods were always the same. Arrive in a state, conduct a thorough, secret investigation of its jails and almshouses, compile a devastating memorial, and then leverage public opinion and private lobbying to force lawmakers to act. She traveled from New Hampshire to Louisiana, from Illinois to Mississippi. She endured treacherous journeys by train, steamboat, and carriage. Her health often failed her, but her resolve never did. And everywhere she went, she won. She shamed legislatures into building new hospitals. She convinced them to fund humane care. She was directly responsible for the founding or enlargement of over 30 mental hospitals in the United States, and even took her campaign to Europe and Canada. She did more to change the physical landscape of mental health care than any single person in American history. Through her efforts, hundreds of thousands of people were moved out of those squalid cellars and cages, and into new state-funded asylums built specifically for their care. It was an achievement of monumental proportions, a triumph of compassion over cruelty. Dorothea Dix had almost single-handedly forced the state to take responsibility for its most vulnerable citizens. She had replaced the chaos of the jailhouse with the order of the hospital. But in this great, necessary, and heroic act, an unintended and tragic consequence was born. The very scale of her success sowed the seeds of the next crisis. By convincing the state to build on such a massive scale, she cemented the asylum as the only solution. The institutions she helped create were vast, often holding thousands of patients. They were built on a scale far beyond what the moral treatment pioneers had ever envisioned. And because they were state-run, they were perpetually subject to the whims of political budgets and bureaucratic indifference. The focus shifted from individual cure to mass custody. The new state hospitals, born from a movement of profound compassion, were destined to become something their creator never intended. They became isolated cities on a hill, cut off from the communities they served, growing larger, more impersonal, and more powerful with each passing year. Dorothea Dix had rescued the mentally ill from the cellar, but she had inadvertently paved the way for them to be locked away in a new gilded cage. The era of the mega-asylum had begun. These new institutions were monuments to a revolutionary idea. Imagine a palace built not for a king, but for the broken mind. This was the vision of Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride, a Philadelphia physician whose influence would shape the very landscape of American mental health for nearly a century. The Kirkbride Plan, as it came to be known, wasn't just an architectural blueprint. It was a philosophy carved in stone and brick. The theory was called moral treatment, and it was beautifully, breathtakingly optimistic. It held that mental illness wasn't a curse or a moral failing, but a disease of the mind that could be cured. And the cure was the asylum itself. The building was the medicine. Kirkbride designed his asylums with meticulous care. They were often built in a batwing or echelon layout, with long sprawling wings branching off a central administration building. This ensured that every single patient room had a window with direct sunlight and fresh air. The light and air, as he called it, were considered essential therapeutic agents. The grounds were just as important. These asylums were set on hundreds of acres of rolling countryside, featuring manicured gardens, serene walking paths, farms, and workshops. The isolation was deliberate. By removing patients from the stresses of urban life, from the families and environments that may have contributed to their illness, it was believed their minds could find the peace necessary to heal. Inside, the patient's day was structured with purpose. Mornings might be spent working on the asylum's farm or in its workshops, engaging in what was called therapeutic labor. Afternoons were for recreation, reading in the library, listening to music in the grand hall, playing games, or attending lectures. The goal was to re-engage the mind, to restore a sense of order and purpose to a life that had devolved into chaos. The staff-to-patient ratio was intended to be high, allowing doctors and nurses to build personal relationships with those in their care. This was not imprisonment. It was a total immersive therapeutic environment. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like America had found the answer. But what happens when a noble dream collides with the harsh reality of public funding and human nature? The very grandeur of the Kirkbride asylums became their undoing. State legislatures were proud to fund the construction of these magnificent buildings. They were symbols of civic progress and compassion. But the year-over-year operational costs, the salaries for doctors and nurses, the food, the heating, the maintenance, that was a much harder sell. The first and most fatal problem was overcrowding. The asylums were built with a specific capacity in mind, one that allowed the principles of moral treatment to function. But as soon as they opened, the floodgates opened with them. Counties and towns, eager to rid themselves of their undesirables, began shipping people off to the state asylum. It wasn't just the curably insane that Kirkbride envisioned. It was the elderly with dementia, people with epilepsy, alcoholics, rebellious teenagers, and inconvenient wives. Anyone who didn't fit neatly into society could be committed, often with little more than the signature of a relative and a local doctor. The asylums swelled to 2, 3, even 4 times their intended capacity. The beautiful private rooms designed for healing became crowded dormitories. Hallways and basements were converted into makeshift wards. The light and air of Kirkbride's vision was snuffed out by the sheer mass of human bodies. The carefully planned therapeutic schedules collapsed. How could you provide individualized care when a single doctor was now responsible for hundreds, sometimes thousands of patients? The high-minded physicians who had been drawn to the promise of moral treatment became little more than beleaguered administrators, their days consumed by paperwork and logistics. The trained nurses and attendants were replaced by low-wage, untrained guards, many of whom were simply there to collect a paycheck and keep the inmates from escaping. Compassion curdled into control. Therapy devolved into warehousing. The sprawling, isolated grounds, once intended for healing, now served a different purpose: to keep the problem out of sight and out of mind for the general public. The asylums became human dumping grounds. Families could send their loved ones away and forget. Society could cleanse itself of those who made it uncomfortable. And as the public forgot, the funding dried up even further. The manicured lawns grew wild. Paint peeled from the walls of the great halls. The palaces for the broken mind began to crumble, both literally and figuratively. Life inside these decaying institutions became a nightmare. With no therapeutic activities, patients were left to languish in crushing boredom and despair. Days were spent sitting in silence on hard benches or pacing endlessly in crowded day rooms. The lack of staff and resources meant that basic sanitation often failed. The stench of urine and unwashed bodies became a permanent feature. Violence was common, both between patients and from the overworked, underpaid staff who resorted to brutality to maintain order. The very architecture designed for healing became a tool of oppression. The long, straight corridors made it easy for a handful of attendants to supervise hundreds of patients. The heavy locked doors ensured no one could leave. The asylum was no longer a place of cure, but a place of confinement. The goal was no longer to return patients to the world, but to manage them until they died. And as the dream of moral treatment died, a new, more terrifying philosophy began to take its place. If the mind couldn't be coaxed back to health with kindness and fresh air, perhaps it could be shocked back into submission. The medical staff, desperate for solutions and armed with a dangerous lack of understanding of the human brain, began to experiment. This wasn't therapy, it was an assault. They began using hydrotherapy, but it wasn't the gentle spa treatment we think of today. Patients were forcibly submerged in ice-cold baths for hours, or even days, to induce a state of shock. Others were wrapped tightly in wet, cold sheets and left immobilized, a practice called cold packing. They were blasted with high-pressure hoses, a painful and humiliating ordeal meant to jolt them out of their psychosis. But this was just the beginning. A darker, more invasive form of science was lurking on the horizon. Doctors started to believe that the source of madness lay deep within the body's physical systems. They began pulling teeth, removing tonsils, and even excising parts of the colon, believing that hidden infections were poisoning the brain. When that failed, they turned to more radical, more terrifying methods. They saw the mind not as something to be nurtured, but as a machine to be violently reset. The era of kindness was over. The age of the ice bath, the insulin coma, and the electric shock was dawning. And something even worse, a procedure that would become the most infamous in the history of psychiatry, was about to be invented. A simple tool, a bit of ice, and a hammer would soon be used to sever the soul from the mind, all in the name of a cure. The procedure was first conceived not in America, but in Portugal by a neurologist named Agos Muniz. He theorized that mental illness was caused by faulty wiring in the frontal lobes of the brain, fixed circuits of thought that trapped patients in cycles of obsession and distress. His solution was brutally simple: sever those circuits. In 1935, he performed the first leucotomy, drilling holes into a patient's skull and injecting pure alcohol to destroy the brain tissue. It was a crude, bloody, and imprecise affair, but in a world with no other options, it was seen as a breakthrough. Some patients did become calmer, more manageable. And for this, in 1949, Agos Moniz would be awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine. But it was an American neurologist, a man of immense ambition and theatrical flair named Walter Freeman, who saw the true potential. Freeman believed Moniz's method was too slow, too complicated, too surgical. He wanted something faster, easier, something that could be done not just in an operating theater, but in any asylum on any patient by any psychiatrist. He wanted to take the lobotomy to the masses, and he found his inspiration in the most mundane of household objects: an ice pick. Freeman developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy. It was a masterpiece of macabre efficiency. No drilling, no operating room, no general anesthetic. Just a quick jolt of electroshock to render the patient unconscious. Then Freeman would lift the patient's eyelid, slide the long, thin instrument, the orbitoclast, his custom-designed ice pick, into the corner of the eye socket, right up against the eyeball. He'd push it upwards until he felt the thin plate of bone separating the eye from the brain. Then, he would take a small rubber or bronze mallet. A few sharp, decisive taps. A sickening crunch as the bone gave way. The pick was now inside the skull, inside the frontal lobe, the very seat of human personality. With a sweeping motion, a swish back and forth like a windshield wiper, he would sever the connections. He would sever the fibers that govern personality, complex thought, and emotional response. Then he'd pull it out and do the other side. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Freeman wasn't just a doctor. He was an evangelist. He saw himself as a liberator, freeing thousands from the living death of catatonia and psychosis. He was a showman, often performing for audiences of doctors and nurses, sometimes using both hands to lobotomize both eye sockets at once for dramatic effect. He saw the overflowing asylums, the desperate families, the human wreckage of severe mental illness, and he believed he had found the answer. Not a cure, but a taming. A way to quiet the storm in the mind, even if it meant extinguishing the light within. And America, desperate for a solution, embraced him. From the late 1930s through the 1950s, the lobotomy became a shockingly common procedure. It was performed on an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 Americans. It was touted as a miracle for schizophrenia, for debilitating depression, for anxiety. But the definition of illness began to stretch. It was used on veterans suffering from what we now call PTSD. It was used on people with chronic headaches. It was even used on rebellious teenagers and disobedient wives. The goal, often unstated but brutally clear, was not to heal, but to control. To make the difficult, the inconvenient, the troublesome docile. The results were a horrifying gamble. A small percentage of patients did report feeling relief from their tormenting symptoms and were able to leave asylums. But for the vast majority, the outcome was catastrophic. The procedure didn't just sever faulty circuits. It bludgeoned the core of a person's identity. Patients were left with what was called surgically induced childhood. They became apathetic, listless, emotionally flat. They lost their spark, their ambition, their creativity. They were ghosts in their own bodies, placid shells of the people they once were. And in about 15% of cases, they died. Nowhere is the tragedy of the lobotomy more apparent than in the story of one of America's most famous families. Rosemary Kennedy was the third child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, the vibrant, beautiful sister of a future president. But she was different. She struggled in school. And as she entered her 20s, she became prone to mood swings and fits of rage. Her father, Joe Kennedy, a man obsessed with perfection and power, saw his daughter's struggles not as a personal challenge, but as a family liability. A potential embarrassment that could derail the political ambitions he had for his sons. He heard about Walter Freeman's 10-minute miracle. He was promised it would calm her, make her more manageable. In 1941, at the age of 23, without consulting his wife, Joe Kennedy made the decision. He subjected his own daughter to the ice pick lobotomy. The result was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. The storm was quieted, yes, but the light was gone forever. Rosemary Kennedy was left with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old. She couldn't walk or speak intelligibly. She was incontinent. The vibrant young woman was erased. Joe Kennedy, horrified at what he had done, immediately sent her away to a private institution in Wisconsin. He told friends and reporters that she was reclusive, a schoolteacher living a quiet life. The family's darkest secret was locked away from the world for decades, a living ghost haunting the Kennedy dynasty. Meanwhile, Walter Freeman's crusade reached its zenith. He took his show on the road in a van he nicknamed the Lobotomobile. He traveled across the country from one state asylum to another, performing dozens of lobotomies a day. It was assembly line psychiatry, a quick jolt of electroshock, the pick, the hammer, the swish. Next, he performed over 3,400 lobotomies himself, including one on a 4-year-old child for behavioral problems. He kept meticulous records, not of his patients' well-being, but of the procedure itself, a chilling testament to his obsession. But even as Freeman crisscrossed the country in his Lobotomobile, a revolution was quietly brewing. The whispers of doubt in the medical community were growing into a roar of condemnation. Was this a treatment, or was it a mutilation? Was he calming patients, or just making them easier to manage for overworked asylum staff? The horror stories began to pile up, stories of lives not saved, but permanently, irrevocably ruined. The public, once enamored with the idea of a quick fix, began to see the grim reality. The lobotomy was falling out of favor, not just because of its brutality, but because something better was on the horizon. Across the Atlantic, in a French laboratory, a chemist was about to stumble upon a discovery that wouldn't just challenge the lobotomy, it would make it obsolete. A simple pill was about to do what the ice pick never could: treat the symptoms of psychosis without destroying the person. The age of psychosurgery was about to be violently overthrown by the age of psychopharmacology. The era of the hammer and the ice pick was ending, and the era of the chemical cure was about to begin. And that chemical cure arrived not from a psychiatrist's lab, but from a surgeon's operating theater. In the early 1950s, a French naval surgeon named Henri Labret was looking for a better way to reduce surgical shock in his patients. He experimented with a new antihistamine cocktail, a compound called chlorpromazine, and he noticed something odd. Before surgery, his patients weren't just physically relaxed, they were mentally detached, profoundly calm, in a state he described as euphoric quietude. They were awake, but their anxiety, their fear, it had simply evaporated. Labret wondered, if this drug could calm the anxieties of a patient facing a surgeon's knife, what could it do for a mind at war with itself? He passed his findings on to psychiatrists in Paris, who decided to try it on a patient with severe mania and psychosis. The results were stunning. Within days, a man who had been uncontrollably agitated for weeks became calm, coherent, and manageable. He wasn't cured in the way we think of curing an infection, but his reality had been re-anchored. The storm inside his mind had subsided to a gentle rain. Word of this miracle crossed the Atlantic. In 1954, the American pharmaceutical company Smith, Kline in French released chlorpromazine under a new, powerful brand name, Thorazine. It was marketed as a major tranquilizer, a drug that could do what no treatment before it could, specifically target the symptoms of psychosis. Unlike barbiturates that simply knocked patients out, Thorazine quieted the hallucinations. It silenced the terrifying voices. It untangled the paranoid delusions. For the first time, doctors had a tool that didn't just restrain the body, but seemed to quiet the madness itself. The effect on the American asylum system was immediate and seismic. Within a year of its introduction, over 2 million people had been prescribed Thorazine. Hospital wards that had been filled with constant screaming and violent outbursts became eerily quiet. Patients who had been catatonic for years, locked in their own private worlds, began to interact with staff. Nurses could suddenly manage entire wards by themselves. It was hailed as a revolution, a liberation. Some called it the chemical lobotomy, but one that was reversible, adjustable, and far less barbaric. It was a key, a chemical key that promised to unlock the asylum doors from the inside. This pharmacological revolution couldn't have come at a better time. The public conscience was already raw from the exposés of asylum conditions. The cost of maintaining these massive state institutions was becoming unsustainable. And now there was a belief, a powerful and optimistic belief, that we didn't need them anymore. If a pill could manage the worst symptoms of mental illness, why lock people away in remote, decaying buildings? Why not treat them in their own communities, where they could remain with their families, hold jobs, and live productive lives? This idea became the central pillar of a powerful new movement, deinstitutionalization, and it found its most powerful champion in the White House. President John F. Kennedy had a deeply personal connection to the failures of institutional mental health care. His own sister, Rosemary, had been subjected to a prefrontal lobotomy in 1941 to treat her mood swings and intellectual disabilities. The procedure was a catastrophe. It left her with the mental capacity of a toddler, unable to walk or speak intelligibly, and she was hidden away in an institution for the rest of her life. This family tragedy haunted Kennedy, and it fueled his resolve to create a new system. In February 1963, he stood before Congress and delivered a landmark address, the first and only time a U.S. president has dedicated a special message solely to mental health. He called for a bold new approach, shifting the focus away from what he called cold mercy of custodial isolation and toward comprehensive community care. He envisioned a network of local centers where anyone could go for therapy, medication management, and crisis intervention. It was a vision of hope, integration, and dignity. Later that year, in October 1963, Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Act into law. It was a moment of incredible bipartisan optimism. The plan was to build 1,500 comprehensive community mental health centers across the country. The federal government would provide the seed money, and the states would take over funding from there. The great emptying of the asylums began in earnest. The patient population in state mental hospitals, which had peaked at over 500,000 in 1955, began to plummet. Between 1960 and 1980, the number of institutionalized patients dropped by over 75%. On paper, it looked like a resounding success, a triumph of modern medicine and progressive social policy. But a beautiful dream was beginning to collide with a harsh reality. The promise of the new drugs like Thorazine came with a dark side. While they were effective at managing psychosis, the side effects could be severe. Patients often described feeling like zombies, emotionally blunted and disconnected from the world. Long-term use could lead to a disfiguring and often irreversible neurological disorder called tardive dyskinesia, causing involuntary tics, grimaces, and tremors. Thorazine wasn't a cure. It was a chemical straitjacket. It made people manageable, but it didn't necessarily make them well. And the second, even more critical failure, was the promise of community care itself. The vision of 1,500 well-funded, comprehensive centers never materialized. Only about half were ever built. Federal seed money ran out, and states, seeing a golden opportunity to slash their budgets, were all too happy to close their expensive mental hospitals without properly funding the community centers that were supposed to replace them. The logic was brutal and simple. It's far cheaper to give someone a bottle of pills and a bus ticket than it is to house and care for them 24/7. So, patients were discharged by the thousands, often with little more than a prescription and a vague instruction to follow up at a local clinic that might not even exist. They were sent out into a world that wasn't prepared for them, a world that still feared and stigmatized them. They lacked housing, job skills, and the basic support systems necessary to navigate life on the outside. The family ties that were supposed to welcome them home had often been severed by years of institutionalization. They were free, but they were also abandoned. A new tragic pattern began to emerge: the revolving door. A patient would be discharged, stop taking their medication because of the side effects or lack of support, spiral into crisis, and end up back in a hospital emergency room only to be stabilized and discharged again. They were trapped in a cycle of brief hospitalizations and chronic instability. The Great Liberation, the emptying of the asylums, had a terrible, unforeseen consequence. We hadn't solved the problem of severe mental illness. We had just changed its address. The sick were no longer confined to the back wards of state hospitals, hidden from public view. Instead, they became the public view. They began to appear in bus stations, in public parks, in library reading rooms, and in the doorways of storefronts. They were sleeping on grates and begging for change. The asylum walls had crumbled, but in their place, two new, even more insidious institutions were rising to take their place: the homeless shelter and the county jail. The well-intentioned dream of community care had inadvertently created a nightmare of public neglect, turning America's streets and its prisons into the new asylums. The year is 1981. A new president, Ronald Reagan, is in the White House, carrying a mandate for sweeping change. His philosophy is one of smaller government, individual responsibility, and fiscal conservatism. And in the crosshairs of this new ideology is the fragile, underfunded, and aspirational federal commitment to mental health. The Mental Health Systems Act of 1980, the crowning achievement of the Carter administration and the last great hope for a national community care network, was barely a year old. It had authorized funding, laid out a framework, and promised a future where care was local, accessible, and humane. But it was a promise that would never be kept. With the stroke of a pen, the Reagan administration passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. This single piece of legislation didn't just defund the Mental Health Systems Act, it erased it from existence. It took the federal money intended for specific community mental health centers and bundled it into block grants given directly to the states. On the surface, this was framed as returning power to local governments. The reality was a catastrophe. The block grants came with a 25% cut in federal funding right off the top, and the states, now free to spend the money as they saw fit, often diverted the already reduced funds to other priorities, leaving mental health services to starve. This wasn't just a budget cut. It was a fundamental abandonment of responsibility. The federal government had officially washed its hands of the deinstitutionalization crisis it had helped create. The dream of community care, already struggling, was now dead on arrival. The thousands of people who were supposed to find support in neighborhood clinics and halfway houses found nothing. They were left stranded in a policy vacuum, invisible to a system that no longer acknowledged their existence. And so they fell into the only two systems left that couldn't turn them away: law enforcement and emergency rooms. The result was a brutal and rapid criminalization of mental illness. Imagine a young man in his 20s, his mind beginning to fracture under the onset of schizophrenia. In 1960, his family might have had him committed to a state hospital. In the idealized 1970s, he would have been connected with a community mental health center for therapy and medication. But in the 1980s, his paranoia leads him to shout at unseen phantoms on a public street. His disorganization leads him to shoplift a sandwich because he can't navigate the bureaucracy of food stamps. He's not a criminal. He's sick. But the police officer who responds doesn't see a patient. He sees a public nuisance, a disturbance. The community clinic that could have diagnosed him is closed. The hospital bed that could have stabilized him is gone. So he is arrested. In court, his symptoms are misinterpreted as defiance or drug use. He can't afford a lawyer, and the overworked public defender has no training in mental health. He is sentenced to jail for a minor offense. And inside that concrete box, his condition deteriorates catastrophically. The noise, the violence, the lack of treatment, it's the polar opposite of a therapeutic environment. He becomes trapped in a revolving door, cycling from the street to the jail cell and back again. This personal tragedy, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, transformed America's correctional facilities. By the 1990s, the Los Angeles County Jail, Chicago's Cook County Jail, and New York's Rikers Island had become, by default, the three largest mental health institutions in the entire country. Sheriffs and wardens trained in security were forced to become frontline psychiatric providers, a role they were never meant to fill, and for which they were given virtually no resources. It was a humanitarian crisis hiding in plain sight, a quiet horror unfolding within the walls of the American justice system. While one part of this abandoned population filled the prisons, the other filled the streets. The 1980s witnessed an explosion of homelessness on a scale not seen since the Great Depression. Tent cities sprung up in public parks, and alleyways became bedrooms. And at the heart of this crisis were the severely mentally ill. They were the most visible, the most vulnerable, and the most misunderstood. The public, which had once been swayed by the promise of compassionate community care, now saw only frightening and unpredictable figures on their city sidewalks. The stereotype of the crazy homeless person became a cultural fixture, a cruel caricature that deepened stigma and replaced empathy with fear and disgust. The very people who needed the most compassion were instead met with scorn, becoming symbols of urban decay, rather than victims of a collapsed system. But just as the social and governmental structures for mental health were crumbling, a different kind of revolution was brewing, not in a government building but in the laboratory. The pharmaceutical industry was on the verge of a breakthrough that would change everything. The older antipsychotics and antidepressants of the 50s and 60s were effective for some, but they were blunt instruments, often coming with debilitating side effects like tremors, cognitive dulling, and severe weight gain. But in 1987, the FDA approved a new drug. Its chemical name was fluoxetine. Its brand name was Prozac. Prozac was the first of a new class of drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. They were marketed as a targeted, elegant solution to the messiness of the mind. The theory, which was brilliantly simple and incredibly marketable, was that depression was caused by a chemical imbalance. specifically, a lack of serotonin in the brain. Prozac, the theory went, simply corrected this imbalance. It was a clean biological explanation for a deeply complex human experience. And for a nation uncomfortable with the ambiguities of psychoanalysis and weary of the visible failures of the social system, it was the perfect message at the perfect time. The impact was immediate and seismic. Pharmaceutical companies launched massive direct-to-consumer advertising campaigns, a practice that had only recently been legalized. Suddenly, commercials on television and glossy ads in magazines were encouraging people to talk to their doctor about depression. The conversation shifted from the psychiatrist's couch to the family doctor's office. Prescribing an SSRI was fast, easy, and required no specialized psychiatric training. For millions of people suffering in silence, Prozac and its successors like Zoloft and Paxil were nothing short of a miracle. They lifted a fog of despair that had seemed permanent, allowing people to function, to work, to feel joy again. It's impossible to overstate the genuine relief these medications brought to an immense number of people. But this pharmaceutical revolution had a profound and deeply problematic side effect. It medicalized sadness and pathologized normal human distress. The pill for every ill mentality took root. The complex interplay of genetics, environment, trauma, and social factors that contribute to mental illness was flattened into the simple narrative of a broken brain circuit. Why invest in expensive, time-consuming psychotherapy or address societal problems like poverty and isolation, when a simple prescription could solve the problem? The pill became the path of least resistance for an underfunded, overburdened healthcare system. For the severely mentally ill, those with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe psychosis, the new drugs offered some benefits, but they were no substitute for the comprehensive support, housing, and therapy that had been promised and then snatched away. The focus had shifted from holistic care of the person to the isolated management of symptoms. America hadn't solved its mental health crisis. It had just decided to medicate it. Yet, out of this landscape of neglect and reductionism, a new and powerful force began to organize. They weren't doctors or politicians. They were mothers and fathers, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives. They were the families who were living the daily reality of the system's failure, watching their loved ones cycle between the streets, the jails, and the emergency rooms. In 1979, a small group of these families had gathered around a kitchen table in Wisconsin to form a grassroots support group. They called themselves the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. Throughout the 80s and 90s, their movement grew exponentially. They were united by love and galvanized by anger. They fought the stigma that had silenced them, lobbied legislators for better funding, demanded better treatments from the medical establishment, and created a nationwide network of support for families who had once felt utterly alone. For the first time, a unified, organized voice for the mentally ill and their caregivers was emerging from the shadows, ready to demand a reckoning and fight for a future that was more than just a jail cell or a prescription pad. This new voice wasn't a single person. It was a chorus born from thousands of hushed conversations in living rooms, anguished phone calls in the dead of night, and desperate meetings in church basements. It was the sound of parents, siblings, and spouses who had been told for decades that their loved one's schizophrenia was their fault, the result of a cold schizophrenic mother, or a dysfunctional family dynamic. They had been sidelined by doctors, shamed by neighbors, and ignored by politicians. But by the late 1970s, the collective weight of their grief and frustration had reached a tipping point. In 1979, in Madison, Wisconsin, a few hundred of these families gathered. They weren't doctors or researchers. They were ordinary people, united by an extraordinary burden. And they formed a group that would change the face of mental health advocacy forever. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. This was a revolution. For the first time, the primary consumers of mental health services, the families who navigated the broken system every single day, were organizing on a national scale. Their goals were simple yet radical. They demanded to be treated as partners in care, not as the cause of the disease. They fought for research, for better treatments, and for an end to the soul-crushing stigma that kept their families isolated. And most importantly, they reframed the narrative. Mental illnesses, they argued, were not character flaws or failures of parenting. They were brain disorders, biological medical conditions just like diabetes or heart disease. This idea, which seems obvious to many of us today, was a seismic shift. It was a declaration of innocence for millions of caregivers, and a powerful new weapon in the fight for public understanding and funding. But as this grassroots movement was gaining steam, a political hurricane was brewing in Washington. In 1981, Ronald Reagan entered the White House with a mandate to shrink the size of government. His philosophy was clear. Federal programs were bloated, inefficient, and an intrusion into the lives of citizens and the rights of states. One of his first major acts was the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. This law didn't just cut funding for social programs, it fundamentally restructured them. It consolidated dozens of federal grants, including the Community Mental Health Centers Act funding, into single block grants given directly to the states. The idea was to give states more flexibility. The reality was a catastrophe. The federal government essentially washed its hands of any direct responsibility for mental health care. States were handed a block of money, a significantly smaller block of money, and told to figure it out. With no federal oversight and shrinking budgets, many states, facing their own economic pressures, diverted those funds to other priorities. The already fragile, underfunded network of community mental health centers was gutted. The very safety net that was supposed to catch the thousands of people being discharged from state hospitals was systematically dismantled, thread by thread. The result was the tragic, visible failure of deinstitutionalization. The revolving door of the hospital became a grim reality. Patients would be stabilized on medication, discharged with a bus ticket and a 2-week supply of pills, and then left to fend for themselves. Without housing, without case managers, without therapy or job training, they would inevitably stop taking their medication, their symptoms would return, and they would spiral into crisis. They'd end up back in the emergency room or worse. The promise of a life with dignity in the community became, for many, a nightmare on the streets. America's homeless population exploded in the 1980s, and study after study showed that a massive percentage of them were people with severe mental illness who had been abandoned by the system. Jails and prisons began to see a new type of inmate. Not hardened criminals but confused, frightened people whose primary crime was being sick in a country that had closed its hospital doors without opening any new ones. The Los Angeles County Jail and New York's Rikers Island were on their way to becoming the largest de facto psychiatric facilities in the United States. It was a perfect storm of good intentions and disastrous policies. And in the middle of it all, a new hope was emerging, not from a government program but from the laboratory. The push by advocates like NAMI to define mental illness as a brain disorder was finding a powerful ally in the world of neuroscience. The old Freudian theories were falling away, replaced by a new focus on neurochemistry, genetics, and brain imaging. Scientists were beginning to map the biological underpinnings of conditions like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression. This biological revolution had a profound effect. For families, it was a profound vindication. It wasn't their fault. It was a matter of brain chemistry, of synapses and receptors. This new paradigm also supercharged the pharmaceutical industry. If mental illness was a chemical problem in the brain, then the solution logically was a chemical one. The first generation of drugs like Thorazine and the early antidepressants had been revolutionary but came with a host of debilitating side effects. Now, drug companies were pouring billions into developing a new generation of medications that were more targeted, more effective, and, crucially, safer. And in late 1987, they hit the jackpot. A little green and white capsule called Prozac. Prozac, the brand name for fluoxetine, was the first of a new class of drugs called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. The theory was simple enough for the public to grasp. Depression was caused by a chemical imbalance, specifically, a lack of the neurotransmitter serotonin. SSRIs worked by blocking the reabsorption, or reuptake of serotonin in the brain, leaving more of it available to improve mood. Whether this theory was entirely accurate is still debated today, but at the time it was a powerful and compelling story. And its timing was perfect. Prozac landed in a culture obsessed with self-improvement and quick fixes. It was launched with one of the most aggressive and brilliant marketing campaigns in pharmaceutical history. It was hailed on magazine covers as a miracle drug. It wasn't just for the severely catatonically depressed. It was for the worried well, for people struggling with dysthymia, a kind of chronic low-grade unhappiness. The psychiatrist Peter Kramer, in his best-selling book Listening to Prozac, even coined the term cosmetic psychopharmacology, suggesting the drug could make people feel better than well, more confident, more assertive, more like the person they always wanted to be. The drug became a cultural phenomenon. It was discussed at dinner parties, featured in movies, and given a nickname, Liquid Sunshine. For millions of people trapped in the gray fog of depression and anxiety, Prozac was a lifeline. It was demonstrably safer than older antidepressants, with far less risk of a fatal overdose, and for many, more manageable side effects. It lifted a burden they thought they would have to carry for their entire lives, allowing them to function, to work, to feel joy again. The stigma around taking medication for mental health began to slowly erode. Asking your doctor for an antidepressant started to feel less like a shameful secret and more like a proactive step toward wellness, like taking medication for high blood pressure. But this new era of psychopharmacology was a double-edged sword. The focus on a chemical imbalance narrative, while destigmatizing, also risked oversimplifying the profound complexities of human suffering. It threatened to reduce every struggle, grief, trauma, loneliness, existential angst, to a mere technical problem in the brain that could be solved with a pill. The art of psychotherapy, of talking through one's problems and understanding their roots, was increasingly seen as inefficient and old-fashioned compared to the quick, clean action of a prescription. Insurance companies, always looking at the bottom line, were far more willing to pay for a monthly prescription than for weekly therapy sessions. The psychiatrist's role shifted, in many cases, from that of a therapist to that of a medication manager, with appointments lasting just 15 minutes, long enough to ask about side effects and write a new script. By the dawn of the 1990s, the landscape of mental health care was fractured and contradictory. On one hand, you had a powerful, organized advocacy movement and a growing public understanding of mental illness as a biological disease. You had new, safer medications that were helping millions and fueling a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. On the other hand, the public system designed to care for the most severely ill was in ruins. The streets and jails were filling with the casualties of deinstitutionalization, abandoned by the state and left to the mercy of a patchwork of underfunded charities and overwhelmed emergency rooms. The federal government had declared the 1990s the decade of the brain, promising a new frontier of scientific discovery that would finally unlock the secrets of the mind and cure its ailments. The hope was immense, but the question remained: could scientific breakthroughs ever be enough to fix a system so fundamentally broken by decades of political neglect and economic calculation? That hope, that glistening promise of a new millennium of the mind, collided almost immediately with the cold, hard reality of a spreadsheet. The 1990s, declared the decade of the brain by President George H.W. Bush, did indeed unleash a wave of neuroscientific discovery. We mapped neural pathways, we understood neurotransmitters like never before, and we developed a new generation of medications, most famously the SSRIs like Prozac, Zoloft and Paxil. These drugs, with fewer side effects than their predecessors, were hailed as miracle cures, capable of rebalancing the very chemistry of despair. They became cultural touchstones, the subject of best-selling books and magazine covers. It seemed for a moment that science had delivered on its promise. We had the tools. But a tool is useless if you can't get it out of the toolbox. And in the 1990s, the toolbox was locked tight by a new gatekeeper: managed care. This was the era of the HMO and the PPO. In an effort to control skyrocketing healthcare costs across the board, the American system shifted towards a model where insurance companies weren't just paying the bills. They were actively managing and often restricting the care patients received. For mental health, this was catastrophic. While a doctor could set a broken leg without much interference, seeking therapy or psychiatric medication meant entering a bureaucratic labyrinth. Suddenly, treatment wasn't just decided between a patient and a doctor. It was subject to approval from a case manager hundreds of miles away, who had never met the patient but held the power to deny claims, limit therapy sessions to a handful per year, or refuse to cover the newer, more effective medications in favor of older, cheaper alternatives. Mental health benefits were often carved out, handled by separate, often smaller, companies that specialized in limiting costs. This created a perverse incentive structure. The less care they provided, the more profit they made. The system was designed not for recovery, but for containment at the lowest possible price. Patients were forced to fail first on cheaper drugs before being approved for the one their doctor actually recommended. A suicidal teenager might be approved for only 6 sessions of therapy, a completely arbitrary number based on a financial calculation, not clinical need. It was a shadow system of healthcare, separate and unequal, reinforcing the ancient stigma that ailments of the mind were somehow less real, less deserving of comprehensive care than ailments of the body. The scientific breakthroughs were real, but for millions they might as well have been happening on another planet. This glaring disparity ignited one of the most important civil rights battles of the late 20th century: the fight for mental health parity. The concept was simple and profoundly just. Insurance coverage for mental illness should be equal to coverage for physical illness. A broken mind should be treated with the same urgency and resources as a broken bone. But simple justice is rarely simple politics. For years, advocates, families, and a handful of dedicated lawmakers fought a grueling war of attrition against the immense lobbying power of the insurance and business communities, who argued that equal coverage would be ruinously expensive. In 1996, a flicker of hope, the Mental Health Parity Act was passed, a bipartisan effort championed by Senators Pete Domenici and Paul Wellstone. It was a landmark in principle, the first federal law to even suggest that insurance plans should not discriminate. But in practice, it was a law riddled with loopholes. It prevented large group health plans from imposing lower annual or lifetime dollar limits on mental health benefits compared to medical benefits. But that's all it did. It didn't mandate that plans cover mental health in the first place. It didn't apply to small businesses. And it didn't say anything about the real tools of discrimination: higher copays, separate deductibles, and those strict, arbitrary limits on therapy sessions or hospital stays. Insurers simply adapted. They couldn't set a lower lifetime limit, fine. Instead, they just capped the number of covered psychiatrist visits at 20 per year. It was like fixing one leaky pipe in a house with a crumbling foundation. The discrimination continued, just in a different form. While politicians debated in Washington, the consequences of this fractured system were playing out in emergency rooms, courtrooms, and morgues across the country. The grim revolving door between hospitals, streets, and jails, which began with deinstitutionalization, was now spinning faster than ever. Jails in Los Angeles County, Cook County, and Rikers Island in New York had become, by default, the three largest mental health facilities in the entire nation. Sheriffs and prison wardens, men and women trained in corrections, were now frontline psychiatric providers, managing thousands of inmates with severe schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression, often with little more than restraining chairs and antipsychotic injections. It was a humanitarian crisis hidden in plain sight, a complete abdication of the promise made decades earlier. Then came the tragedies that America couldn't ignore. The late 90s were punctuated by a series of horrific school shootings, most infamously at Columbine High School in 1999. In the aftermath of such events, the national conversation would inevitably, and often clumsily, turn to mental health. It was a double-edged sword. While it brought much-needed attention to the issue, it also dangerously conflated mental illness with violence in the public imagination, deepening the very stigma that prevented people from seeking help in the first place. The vast majority of people with mental illness are not violent. In fact, they are far more likely to be victims of violence. But these events laid bare the terrifying reality of what can happen when profound distress goes completely unaddressed. The fight for real parity continued, and its heart and soul was Senator Paul Wellstone of Minnesota. He was a fiery, passionate populist who saw the issue not as a line item on a budget, but as a fundamental question of human dignity. He shared his own family's struggles with mental illness and fought tirelessly to close the loopholes of the 1996 law. In 2002, on the verge of a critical election, his plane went down in a frozen Minnesota forest, killing him, his wife, his daughter, and his staff. The cause of mental health had lost its greatest champion. But his death galvanized his allies. In the years that followed, his name became a rallying cry. His best friend in the Senate, Ted Kennedy, along with Republican Senator Pete Domenici, picked up the torch. They refused to let his work die with him. They built a broad coalition, bringing together veterans groups who saw the coming tsunami of PTSD from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, business leaders who were starting to understand the economic cost of untreated depression in the workforce, and an army of grassroots advocates who flooded Capitol Hill with the stories of their lost children, their struggling spouses, their own battles in the dark. Finally, in 2008, as the nation teetered on the brink of financial collapse, they succeeded. The Paul Wellstone and Pete Domenici Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act was signed into law. This was the real deal. It went far beyond the 1996 law. It mandated that if an insurance plan offered mental health and substance abuse benefits, it had to do so on equal footing with medical and surgical benefits. No more separate higher copays. No more wildly restrictive limits on visits. The quantitative treatment limits had to be the same. The qualitative ones, like the shadowy process of pre-authorization, had to be based on the same medical necessity criteria. It was a monumental victory, a legislative triumph decades in the making. Yet, as the ink dried on the new law, a different kind of revolution was quietly brewing, not in the halls of Congress, but in the glowing rectangles of computer screens in basements and bedrooms across America. The internet was coming of age. In the anonymous, text-based world of early message boards, forums, and chat rooms, People were finding something that the healthcare system had never been able to provide: community. They were sharing stories, offering support, and realizing for the first time that they were not alone. People with rare diagnoses found each other across continents. Teenagers questioning their identity found peers who understood. Anonymous confessions of despair were met not with judgment, but with empathy and advice. This was the dawn of a new era of patient empowerment. For the first time, information was democratized. You no longer had to rely solely on a single doctor. You could research medications, learn about different therapeutic modalities, and read the first-hand experiences of thousands of other people. This digital groundswell was beginning to chip away at the isolation that had always been one of the most brutal aspects of mental illness. A powerful new law was now on the books, promising to tear down the financial barriers to care. And a powerful new technology was emerging, promising to tear down the social barriers of stigma and loneliness. The question, heading into a new decade, was whether these two forces could finally combine to create the revolution in mental health that America had been waiting for over 200 years. And then a world-changing event arrived, not as a planned policy or a scientific breakthrough, but as a silent, invisible threat: the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a crisis that didn't just impact a specific demographic or region. It was a collective, global trauma. The very foundations of daily life, work, school, social connection, were pulled out from under the entire world. And in the crucible of lockdown, isolation, and uncertainty, the simmering mental health crisis in America boiled over into a national emergency. Suddenly, the conversation wasn't abstract. It was immediate. It was your neighbor, your child, your boss, and you. The shared experience of pandemic anxiety and grief acted as a great equalizer, a universal solvent that began to dissolve the last, most stubborn vestiges of stigma. It was no longer a question of us versus them, the mentally well versus the mentally ill. There was only us, a nation collectively grappling with fear, loss, and profound psychological stress. This universal crisis forced a change that years of activism and incremental policy had failed to achieve: the explosion of telehealth. Overnight, therapy sessions moved from the couch in a quiet office to the laptop screen in a quiet corner of the house. Regulatory barriers that had hamstrung remote care for decades were swept aside in a matter of weeks out of sheer necessity. For millions, this was a revelation. The logistical hurdles that had kept them from seeking help, travel time, childcare, taking off work, the fear of being seen walking into a therapist's office, vanished. Access, at least in principle, expanded dramatically. Startups that had been niche players in the digital health space became household names, connecting a surge of new patients with a strained but newly accessible network of providers. But this new era is about far more than just video calls. The convergence of technology and mental health has accelerated into something that would have seemed like science fiction just a generation ago. We are now in the age of digital therapeutics, where an app on your phone isn't just a wellness tracker, but a clinically validated, sometimes even FDA-approved treatment. These programs use principles of cognitive behavioral therapy to guide users through exercises, track their moods, and offer in-the-moment support, creating a form of scalable, on-demand mental health care. At the same time, artificial intelligence is being woven into the fabric of care. AI-powered chatbots provide a non-judgmental space for people to talk through their anxieties, available 24/7. AI algorithms are being developed to analyze speech patterns and text messages to predict depressive or psychotic episodes, promising a future of proactive, rather than reactive, intervention. Wearable technology, once the domain of fitness enthusiasts, now tracks heart rate variability, sleep patterns, and stress levels, providing a constant stream of biometric data that can paint a more complete picture of our mental state than ever before. And perhaps the most profound and controversial development is the one that brings our story full circle, back to the search for a true cure. We are witnessing a psychedelic renaissance. After decades of being relegated to the fringes of culture and criminalized by the government, substances like psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, and MDMA are re-emerging at the forefront of psychiatric research. Guided by therapists in controlled clinical settings, these compounds are showing astonishing results in treating some of the most intractable conditions, like post-traumatic stress disorder and treatment-resistant depression. This isn't the counterculture of the 1960s. This is rigorous, double-blind, placebo-controlled science being conducted at the world's most prestigious universities. The early data suggests that these substances, rather than just masking symptoms like many traditional antidepressants, may work by fundamentally rewiring the brain, creating new neural pathways and allowing patients to process trauma and break free from rigid, negative thought patterns. It represents a potential paradigm shift, a move away from lifelong management of a chronic illness and toward the possibility of a lasting cure achieved in just a few sessions. So, is this it? Is this the revolution we've been waiting for? A world of accessible telehealth, intelligent digital support, and powerful new medicines? In many ways, yes. The progress is undeniable. The conversation around mental health is more open and honest than at any point in American history. The tools at our disposal are more powerful and sophisticated than ever imagined. But the revolution is unfinished. For every success story, there are deep, persistent cracks in the foundation. The promise of telehealth is meaningless if you live in a rural area with no broadband internet. It's a hollow victory if you can't find a provider who accepts your insurance, or if you don't have insurance at all. The provider shortage is more acute than ever, with burnout at an all-time high and waitlists stretching for months, leaving millions in a desperate limbo. This new digital world has also created new inequities. The care provided by a chatbot, while helpful, is not a substitute for human connection and clinical expertise. And who owns the deeply personal data we share with these wellness apps? How do we ensure privacy and prevent its exploitation? Furthermore, as the mainstream conversation rightfully embraces anxiety and depression, there is a danger of leaving the most vulnerable behind. The crisis of serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe psychosis, continues unabated. The disastrous policy of deinstitutionalization was never corrected with a robust system of community care. And so, our jails and our streets have become the de facto asylums of the 21st century, a testament to our collective failure to care for those who cannot easily advocate for themselves. The challenges of co-occurring substance use disorders add another layer of complexity that our fragmented system is ill-equipped to handle. The evolution of mental health care in the United States is a story of a nation constantly at war with itself. It's a story of compassion versus fear, science versus stigma, and the idealistic pursuit of healing versus the pragmatic, often brutal, realities of economics and politics. We've journeyed from locking people in chains in basements, believing they were possessed by demons, to designing AI that can predict a depressive episode from the tone of a person's voice. We've gone from lobotomies performed with ice picks to brain scans that can watch a psychedelic compound quiet the circuits of anxiety in real time. We've moved from a culture of absolute silence and shame to one where a simple hashtag can connect millions of people who are struggling. The path has been winding, bloody, and littered with the ghosts of forgotten patients and failed theories. But it has always bent, however slowly, toward progress, toward a deeper understanding, toward a greater sense of our shared humanity. The revolution is not complete. The system is still broken in 1,000 different ways. But for the first time in our history, the technology, the science, and the culture may finally be aligning. The future of mental health is not a destination we will one day arrive at. It is something we are all building right now with every conversation we have, every policy we support, every hand we extend to someone in need. The long, dark journey from the asylum is far from over. But for the first time, the path ahead seems brightly lit.